Welcome back to Beyond Well. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and we have a returning guest with us today. Bonnie Kaplan is the fund advisor of the Nutrition and Mental Health Research Fund and a member of the new International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research. For many years, Bonnie studied developmental disorders in kids, especially ADHD and reading disabilities, and she was part of a team from the University of Calgary and University of British Columbia, which helped in the search for genes that predispose kids to dyslexia. In previous conversations, we've spoken with Bonnie about her work in ADHD and especially the incredible role that nutrition can play. And she joins us today to talk about nutrition and COVID. Hello, Bonnie.
Hi, Sheila. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Good.
I think, so many people have been talking about what we can do to keep our immune system strong during this period. And because you've given us such great guidance on nutrition before, I hope that you don't mind that we're asking about COVID-19 and our immune systems. Have you had some thoughts about what we should be doing right now to make sure that we keep our brains, bodies strong and functioning during this time?
Well, sure. Pretty much, even though I'm not a physician, your audience has to understand that. And my focus is on mental health, not physical health. There's no question that nutrition overall is the foundation of who we are, the foundation of all the cells in our body, the foundation of how all of our systems work. So, for example, I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework in physical health, if you don't mind, Sheila, and then
Sure.
Probably we'll mostly talk about the brain and brain health because that's what I'm most interested in. But there was a really interesting call to action published about 3 years ago in the American Journal of Medicine by a broad group of physicians who were aware of the importance of nutrition for physical health. And to summarize what they said was basically it's important that we start teaching our physicians about nutrition. Nutrition education in medical schools is generally quite deficient. And in making that argument, they pointed out and marshaled the data to prove this, that nutrition is the single most important factor in American disability and premature death.
Wow.
And in fact, nutrition can explain over half of the cases of cardiovascular disease. Isn't that amazing?
Incredible. Yeah.
And so if you look at that and you have to think about the brain and say, well, okay, if it's important for the heart and general physical health and early death and blah, 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 what about the brain? Well, the brain actually is the most nutritionally greedy organ in our body.
It'll take everything.
It takes a whole lot more than it deserves based on size. I usually just say it punches above its weight because our brain is about 2% of our weight, which is really tiny. I mean, we can hold our brain, a human brain. You're not going to hold your own brain. You can hold a human brain just in the palms of your hands. It's a very small organ. But every single estimate of its use of nutrition and oxygen, by the way, is that it really punches it way above its weight, at least 10 times above its weight.
Wow.
So at least 20% of what you're eating is sustaining optimal brain health. So if nutrition is, going back to this framework, if the public accepts the importance of nutrition for cardiovascular disease and diabetes and disability and so forth, why is the message not getting out yet about mental health? It's a very strange situation to me.
The hip bones attached to the, that song? It's sort of like, how would anyone really believe that the brain isn't completely connected to what we consume? I guess I'm not understanding where even a scientific basis for believing that we're not wholly connected, that every organ is dependent upon one another's great functioning, and the brain is the powerhouse of our bodies.
That's right. I think it's because we're dealing with a couple of generations or more that has grown up to think about nutrition in terms of physical strength. Right?
Interesting.
Muscles and bones and not thinking about and not taught about metabolism. I mean, one of the I guess you could say this is an axe that I like to grind, okay, is forget physicians. I mean, they need to go learn about nutrition without a doubt. But why are we not teaching our children in elementary school what nutrients do in their brains? Because that's where the habits in terms of their eating habits really are developed. And if they understood that their brain needs minerals and vitamins and where they need them in metabolic steps every single minute that our heart is beating. Every minute, an entire quart of blood is coursing through our brain. Now, we only have about 6 quarts of blood in our entire brain and body. So that tells you how important the brain is. That every minute, a whole quart is going through our brain. Why is that happening? Why do we have so much complexity in our blood vessels in our brain that, by the way, if you laid them out end to end, your blood vessels from your brain would go around the earth twice.
Wow, incredible.
And that's just from this little tiny organ. That shows you the complexity. So you have to ask, why did we evolve to need that much blood going through our brains? Because there's not that much going through our muscles or even through our gut when we're digesting. And the answer is because of oxygen and nutrients. We need the nutrients carried to our brain so that the neurotransmitters, your listeners probably know that word, the chemicals in our brain that enable our brain cells to talk to each other, so that they are being fabricated, manufactured, all of their precursors are being manufactured, and all the breakdown products are happening at billions of cells doing that every minute that we're alive. And none of those steps occur without minerals and vitamins. That's why, to a biochemist, minerals and vitamins they're not just nutrients, they're cofactors. Cofactors are what enable enzymatic reaction to work in metabolism.
I've been so struck by, I'm on social media a lot, and so many people describing the kind of lack of attention and ADHD that they have during quarantine. And because it's stressful and you don't have a lot of, wonderful ways to get the energy out like you might used to have. But I want you to talk a little bit about what you found out regarding ADHD and the lack of especially micronutrients in the brains of kids who are suffering.
It's very hard. Right now, there's no way to figure out answers to the following 2 questions. What amount of nutrients are going into your brain? And that's important because we know that absorption rate varies depending on your gut function and on who knows what else, right? And the other really important question is, how does that compare to what your personal brain needs? And again, that's really important because we know that some people seem to have inherited a need for more nutrients than other people. And I almost always use myself as an example of this, Sheila. I mean, we've shown, and by we, it's this group of researchers around the world studying nutrition and mental health. We've shown that we can make some depression, anxiety, and ADHD symptoms go away by adding nutrients to their diet, even if they're already eating well. But then there are other people, and I'm one of these, who I inherited a very stable predisposition. I think I could go in the other direction. I've never tested this. I think I could eat processed chemicals and very little real food for a year, and I'd feel awful, and I'd get fat, and I'd be constipated, and I'd probably could shorten my lifespan. But I don't think I'd get depressed or anxious because I don't know what those feelings are.
Yeah,
right?
Interesting.
So we have individual differences. So we don't have answers to those questions which means we can't predict who will benefit from a better diet. But we now have absolutely convincing data worldwide that show that you can decrease symptoms of ADHD, mood and anxiety problems by improving diet and also by adding nutrients in pill form, what most people would call supplements.
Wow,
so
incredible.
We know that it's very important. It's not magic, but it helps.
Yeah, I just want you, because I know you don't endorse any type of micronutrient or nutrient, but which nutrients are most important, especially for ADHD?
I love that question because it's the wrong question. I love to point it out to people. Yeah. I get asked this question all the time, Sheila. Which are the nutrients I should be taking? What are the important ones? And the answer is they're all important. And that's why we've inherited a need for all of them. And we have to get them in balance. And that's why nature has packaged them so brilliantly together in the right proportions, in the right balance, in the plants that we need to eat. And we have evolved to need them in that balance if we're eating really nutritious food. Now there's a stumbling block there. okay? And that is, there's very good data to show that the minerals in our soil are not as rich and broad spectrum as they used to be in the majority of our soils. And that includes even some organic farms. I mean, organic needs no pesticides, but people have not been adding back in the roughly 15 minerals that our soil needs to grow healthy plants. Now, I'm going to tell you something that should also be taught in elementary school, because I don't think a lot of people understand this, and that is how we get our vitamins. It turns out it's only because plants are so smart. Plants absorb roughly 15 minerals from the soil. And they use those minerals to synthesize vitamins, approximately 15. And we come along and we eat the plants and we get, voila, roughly 30 minerals and vitamins that we need all the time. Or we eat the animals that eat the plants.
Yeah.
Our cows are not carnivores, right? They're eating plants.
Right.
They're herbivores. So we eat the herbivores that eat the plants, or we eat the plants directly, or we eat both if we're not vegetarians. And that's how we get almost all of our vitamins and minerals. And just one last thing. The reason I said plants are smarter than we are is that humans cannot synthesize all those vitamins. We can synthesize the tiniest amount of some of the B vitamins in our gut, and that's it. So except for vitamin D, if we're in the sun enough, then our skin can synthesize vitamin D. So we have to have those minerals in the soil.
I want you to talk about crisis and what happens to our ability to process food and nutrients during crisis, if you would.
The reason we know that nutrients are so important in a crisis, first let me mention something about physical health.
Okay.
Everybody is in absolute terror right now, and I think for good reason, that when this virus gets into the developing world, where they don't have enough water to wash their hands constantly or clean water, and into the refugee camps where all these people from Syria, etc., are packed in again without, what they need, that we're really in trouble, and they're especially in trouble. And it's partly because of lack of water, but it's also because these are people who are not getting adequate nutrition now. So they are physically very at risk. Their immune systems are not going to be able to withstand viruses as well as some of the rest of us Western well-fed individuals. So physically, this crisis is very, very scary. But at a broader scale, any kind of stress is never good, right? I mean, some people say stress kind of is what gets me going and it gets me motivated to get my work done. Okay, if you're a procrastinator, maybe there's a little bit of value in stress.
Yeah, right.
But otherwise, stress isn't good for anybody, for anything. And we know that stress does decrease the immune system function, okay, in many people. But we also know that if you increase nutrients following stress, then we can decrease the PTSD, post-traumatic stress kinds of problems. We can decrease the anxiety, that people are more resilient. That's the bottom line. They are mentally more resilient. Even if before the crisis they had no mental health problems, we are, all of us, stressed now, right?
You bet.
The better nourished you are, the more resilient you will be to that stress. How do we know that? Well, this all started, there have been about 8 or 10 clinical trials worldwide showing that B complex, even in university students who are just anxious about tests coming up, okay, exam time stress, that if they take a daily B complex, they are better able to cope with that stress.
Wow,
okay?
Cool.
Cheap and easy over-the-counter B complex. But in addition, starting in about 2012, Professor Julia Ruckledge, who is at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, was in the middle of studying broad spectrum nutrients in people with ADHD. She's published clinical trials in children and adults with ADHD using broad spectrum. That's more than B complex. That's the whole roughly 30 nutrients, okay? And they had this massive earthquake in 2010.
Wow.
And then they had another massive earthquake in 2011. And in the intervening period between those two major earthquakes, they had 8,000 aftershocks.
Oh my
So they
gosh.
had this incredibly stressed out population. And what she showed in a series of studies was that people who were given additional nutrients as supplements were more resilient. They had less probable PTSD. It dropped from 60 some percent to 19% in 6 weeks. It was amazing.
Wow.
They had less stress. They reported less anxiety. They were better. They were more resilient. Okay?
Wow.
And
Incredible.
then the next year, we had a major flood in southern Alberta. And Julia called me and said, go talk to your mayor. She and I collaborated on a post-flood study. Again, general population, not clinically diagnosed people. In fact, they were excluded, people who had a diagnosis of depression or anxiety. And again, in our study, we showed either B complex or a broad spectrum formula had equal results on most of the measures, though not all. Broad spectrum was better on some in people after the flood. And then she's continuing this research right now. And now she's trying to get a COVID-19 study up and running.
Well, we need it now more than ever, especially with how many people are trapped at home and without great access to good nutrition, either because of economic concerns or just we developed a lot of food islands here in America where people don't have easy access to a grocery store. And if they want to get fresh produce, they have to go a long, long way to get it. So
that's a real problem.
So hopefully the idea of being able to supplement one's diet is a really, really smart suggestion for people right now.
I think it's great that Julia is doing trying to do a COVID-19 study. I don't know if it's going to get through ethics, et cetera, but there's a part of me that thinks, why do we keep studying this?
Yeah, we know.
We know without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, our ancestors knew. It's clear. And by the way, we have data from massive forest fires that happened in northern Alberta. And that would have been in about 2016 after our flood, and they would not let me educate the public about just going and getting an over-the-counter B complex. And so 2 years later, 50% increase in doctor's appointments for mood and anxiety problems.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to spread the good word. Honestly, Bonnie, I think that the stuff that you're doing is so, so very important. And you may be decades ahead of your time, but for people who really stop and think about it, this goes back to the Bible. This goes back to some of the teachings about just the importance of nutrition that we've had for centuries. So it's not like it's anything new.
Why do we ignore the brain when we're talking about nutrition and health?
Yeah. Well, it's been so wonderful to catch up with you again, Bonnie, and I'm really wishing that you remain very healthy and continue to do this kind of work. We'll get the word out about those bees, okay? All right.
Thanks very much for your time, Sheila. It's delightful to talk to you.
It's always good to talk with you. Our show is brought to us by the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care, and if you want to learn more, please click here.